Hello. Same with the poverty video, you can say, how is negativity not just stress? And everybody is stressed, therefore suck it up, get over it. Well, first of all, no, that's not how negativity works, you will see. Also, there are different kinds of stress, and not every kind makes you wish you were catapulted into space instead. And it's cool that the specifics of our reactions to negativity in our brains, biological impacts of loneliness, and the negativity of news have been documented in more detail. We do not just get over negative experiences, unfortunately, and their impact is surprisingly deep. Sources in the description box, and one more housekeeping point, the research is statistical, not deterministic. You can very well be the exception in how you handle negativity, but the human spectrum has a stable middle, which we will talk about now. Everything seems so bad now, everywhere, all the time, but by how much? It's tempting to say that you see reality clearly, but you probably can't. Humans are unable to be neutral observers in this area because we have a negativity bias, which actually gets stronger the more negativity we encounter. And being mindful of negativity can only partially compensate for this bias, because when you use EEG to capture the very early reactions to stimuli, we are talking milliseconds here, or thousandths of a second, your brain will have classified a thing as negative and given it more attention before you even have a chance to form a thought about it. Negativity bias served us well in the past, but it was not meant to be a permanent state, so right now we are operating in what I would call an evolutionary blind spot, because this is unprecedented. And it makes more and more people isolated, more than would be natural, I would say. Our human nature is usually framed as we are social animals, but that doesn't quite make you feel how important other people are for each and every one of us. At this point, I would even call it we are not singular-bodied organisms, and it has been heavily implied by research, though not in those exact words. We usually think that cognition functions independently of our social life, but nothing could be further from the truth, and it also might have been our social life that led to the development of our higher cognition. Toddlers and chimps do not really differ in their physical skills, but human toddlers have a much more developed set of social skills. Without social engagement, our sense of reality, which is created through interactions with others, slips away. When you have nobody to ground you in reality, your world is altered in fundamental ways, and coincidentally, altered in ways which make it harder for you to get out. Neuroimaging studies show that lonely people unintentionally pay more attention to negative social information. Lonely individuals have a smaller reaction in their ventral striatum, which is an area of the brain responsible for giving you positive rewards. Their visual cortex lights up more in response to negative social cues. And the reaction in their temporoparietal junction, which is an area in the brain responsible for helping you see things from other people's point of view, is also reduced, meaning lonely people do not pay as much attention to how other people are feeling and therefore are kind of like centering themselves primarily. Some papers describe a self-reinforcing loop, however, how you get to the lonely state is still a matter to be determined. They differentiate between a fleeting loneliness, which everyone experiences, and chronic loneliness, which results in actual brain changes. And how you get from state A to state B, as far as I was able to find, or rather unable to find, so far we don't know. But once somebody is there, the near-automatic self-reinforcement has been analyzed in detail. Negatively biased perception leads to more defensive and hostile attitude, which leads to negative experiences, and that makes the cycle complete. And it's not like there is a unifying trend among all lonely individuals. Their fMRI results were all very different from each other, but the non-lonely people were similar. It's genuinely fascinating. Obviously, then all of these differences make it harder to achieve a shared sense of understanding with others, which is obviously central to feeling socially connected. And you cannot just say, lonely people should just hang out together. They are as different from one another as they are from the non-lonely people. Once you know all this, I think it has to give you pause whether you are just experiencing the symptoms of loneliness or if the world is actually turning more negative. But the vibes we all get from the news don't lie, right? You just know. Well, the world is more negative. You can make that inference from all the studies, but it is unfortunately not explicitly proven to be related, at least not on a large scale. But even incremental changes towards the negative among people over time would, I think, result in a ripple effect. One good study to have looked at the large-scale long-term aspects in which the news changed and whether it was towards the negative was done by the RAND Corporation, a non-profit. They did not just cover negativity in news, but also other linguistic choices, and the data spanned all the way from 1989 to 2017. But they defined negativity in a very narrow manner, just simply words with negative affect. Because it was a large sample, even small changes, which were indeed observed, produced statistically significant results. But because it was a large sample, it was labeled as not very meaningful. But it's a common choice when you have a large sample you studied. But what they saw changed was the immediacy and the way the news are presented. Broadcast news in the 90s slowly started to rely on narratives and personal point of view of people experiencing these events. Cable news became more argumentative. Overall, you no longer get as much data with your news or abstract concepts. I think it's funny that the paid version became shittier. You can reasonably infer from the report, I think, that more emotional immediacy and exposure to a point of view of an individual who is potentially suffering, even when you don't use a single negative word, will have a bigger negative impact on people. Even when the individual survives and all is well and you feel like you picked the right animal to root for in a David Attenborough documentary, it is generally very taxing on people to have to engage their emotional side. Who made the call to make the news so opinionated and less precise? No one, really. It was a gradual process. It is a consequence of the new journalism movement. The genre combined journalistic research with the techniques of fiction writing in the reporting of stories about real-life events. The writers often credited with the beginning of the movement include Tom Wolfe, Truman Capote, and Gay Talese. The intent behind the movement, which can reasonably be traced back to the 60s and 70s, though there were tendencies to report on the human side of suffering that go as far back as the Great Depression, was to make the news more engaging and human. It's fascinating to me how good intent in somebody's mind almost always results in more chaos and negativity on a large scale. Another study on news affectivity covering the time span of 2000 to 2019, which looked only at the headlines, showed a clear increase in negative words denoting anger, fear, disgust, and sadness in the headlines. It makes sense to negatively colored news is more profitable. A randomized trial showed that each additional negative word in a headline boosted the click-through rate by 2.3%. Only 2.3%, huh? Let's destroy the world because line must go up. Oh yeah, if something works, why not make it ever so slightly worse with optimization? That sounds like a great corporate slogan. From a purely utilitarian perspective, profit is good, right? But we cannot shake negative news easily. According to at least one experiment, women came out as more susceptible to news-related stressors. Don't worry, ladies, men have their vulnerable stress points, but not in relation to news necessarily. The experiment took place with 30 men and 30 women who were randomly reading either neutral or negative news for 10 minutes, and then they were exposed to a Trier social stress test, where the goal is to measure your neurobiological responses. In this case, they collected a sample of their saliva to measure their cortisol levels, stress hormone, and in women that read the negative headlines, it led to a significant increase in cortisol. Even if you could regulate your stress levels insanely well, just the exposure to negative headlines about a person alters your opinion about them, regardless of whether you think it is a credible news source or not. In fact, the negative opinion could be exacerbated if you read a headline from a news source you do not consider credible. Our intuition tells us that staying in the loop has deleterious effects on the human psyche, and yet there are people who demand that everyone should be up to date on the latest news drama, because it is your duty to be informed. Apart from moral virtue signaling like algorithmic-based peacock feathers, it shows they want you as part of their peer group, which I think is nice. Also, people have this delusional notion that when you know things, you can control things more. And anxiety makes you seek out more and more information. I've seen an article titled "Anxious Citizen, Informed Citizen." That's totally normal, and can lead to actual self-reported cases of insomnia and poor mental health due to fear about things ordinary people just reasonably cannot change, like climate change. In a Swedish study, people who have been consuming mainstream news reported increased negative perceptions about things like climate change, which these outlets have been reporting on with overt negativity. People who consumed news from alternative news sources would show increased negativity towards things these outlets again would report on with overt negativity, like crime. And the circle of self-reinforced negativity closes. Maybe emotions about the news is not the way to go. Maybe we all need to follow the orders of our survival instinct. And distraction is a legitimate coping mechanism, and it was actually shown to lead to lower depression rates. But when it comes to long-term effects, how do you actually cure loneliness? Well, context matters. Not everything can be cured or fixed, or easily even. But apparently, cognitive behavioral therapy has been promising. Stress on the word promising. So, retraining people like dogs. Really? Nothing deeper behind it? But I guess it's kind of nice that there is a certain simplicity to humanity. That's it. That's the end of the video. New video should be out tomorrow. I will try. And in the meantime, be kind to yourselves. And subscribe if you thought this video was interesting.